No matter how risky a task is, commitment is aided by passion. Because diving allows them to investigate something that many people are afraid to try, many cave divers are committed. Today, we'll talk about Parker Turner's plunge at the Indian Springs and the scientist who was able to explain how Parker met his tragic end. The Indian Springs are located at Camp Indian Springs, a recreational camp in northwest Florida. The well-known Wakulla Springs and the Floridan Aquifer are accessible through a much larger underwater cave system that includes this one. Turner's Cave Exploration Group, the Woodsville Karst Plane Project, has explored miles of subterranean passages and broken records, WKPP. Indian Springs is deeper than the typical recreational diving limit of 130 feet. You must have diving experience, particular training, and trimix breathing gases with a specially blended oxygen, nitrogen, and helium in order to be permitted to dive here. The spring can currently only be accessed by cave divers who have received the necessary training, credentials, and preparation. Divers must always be under the control of a trained guide. Parker Turner, a native of Louisiana, moved to Destin from Texas in the middle of the 1980s so that he could be close to Florida's cave systems. He has one daughter and was married. In 1988, Parker and his family moved to Tallahassee, where Parker worked as a volunteer trainer for the academic diving department at Florida State University. He gained notoriety for his diving knowledge, debates on diving regulations, and concern for safety. For example, he developed and funded stop signs for North Florida's underwater tunnels that forbade inexperienced divers from entering them. Parker was frequently spotted close to cave entrances, where he would find open water divers and lead them out so that they wouldn't steal their bodies afterwards. A group of WKP cave exploration divers, including Parker Turner and Bill Gavin, gathered at Indian Springs on Sunday, November 17, 1991, in preparation for an exploratory dive. It was the most experienced, accomplished, and well-organized group of cave divers in existence at the time. The goal was to locate fresh tunnels in the deepest part of the cave. They had been preparing for more than 2 years for this Indian Springs mission, the first of numerous exploratory dives. Due to the cave's peculiar structure and the incredible depths where actual investigation would take place, Dr. R.B. Hamilton had developed specific decompression tables. 3 teams were set up to explore the cave. One set of gas bottles would be placed by the first team, and the second team would place the second set of gas bottles that would be utilized on their return trip. The actual cave exploration would be done by the third group, which included Parker and Bill. To reach the cave's entrance, Team 1 went below the surface. Team 2 then entered the room in a like manner. Following suit for the deep-sea exploration was the third team, which included Parker Turner and Bill Gavin. According to the plan, the first and second teams exited the cave after placing the diving equipment in certain locations and left the third team to complete their task. What dive tactics did they employ? They will spend 40 minutes in the tunnel before spending another 25 minutes exploring the 300-foot deep cave. 40 minutes later, they go. They were equipped for the deep dive, which required carefully matched breathing gases and a protracted decompression time, and they were well prepared for it. First, they start with a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen. Next, they would require 2 different sorts of gas mixes. In order to mitigate the effects of nitrogen narcosis on the deeper portions of the cave system, they would then switch to a trimix mixture that contained nitrogen, oxygen, and helium. As backup divers, more seasoned members of the expedition tested out new equipment in the Indian Spring Cave's more shallow portions. The diving went almost entirely according to plan after Parker and Bill arrived. Bill currently had 2,300 sit in his double 104s and predicted Parker would have a similar or somewhat lower pressure. They took 2 to 3 minutes to reach their nitrox cylinders at the top of the area, starting breathing from those and saved their doubles for when they reached the squaw's restriction. They travel from the pond's bottom into a cavern to get here, and from there, a tunnel that extends for a few hundred feet into the restricted area may be accessed. The cave opens up to a broader area with winding tunnels made of rough yellow and white limestone at the squaw's restriction after becoming so narrow that only a single diver and his equipment can fit through. Multiple permanent lines have been constructed throughout the cave system to support divers in that area of the cave even when visibility is significantly reduced. Bill attached a tow strap and increased the speed of his diver propulsion vehicle, DPV. Bill and Parker moved through the tunnels until they arrived at the Wakulla room, a sizable space. They spent a lot of time in the Wakulla room, and at 63 minutes into the dive, 2 minutes ahead of schedule, they began to leave. Parker saw that his DPV's battery was going low as they headed home. As a result, Bill pulled Parker and himself forward by attaching Parker to his scooter. They were only around 1,500 feet away from the entrance at this point, so this was not a significant problem. They then arrived at a clear arrow marking at the intersection of the upstream and downstream, which was about 500 feet away from the entrance. Bill calculated that they would reach this marking around 105 minutes into the dive as per the diving plan. They arrived exactly on time. They noticed that the cave's visibility had decreased when they went left at this arrow. The line was still visible toward the ceiling in the clear water, but the floor was completely obscured by dense clouds of silt. As they got closer to the door, visibility got worse. Due to the extremely poor visibility, they were forced to stop using the scooter and grip the guideline. What led to this? Let's go back to the time when they first began the dive. Two diving team members, English and Irvine, had initially entered Indian Springs and just made a somewhat short dive to test out a brand new scooter that English had just acquired. Before English and Irvine turned back to return to the surface, Turner and Bill had already passed them on their way into the deeper areas. Here's something to do with diving. Divers must rest for extended periods at varied depths to allow their bodies to decompress after emerging from deep water. English and Irvine were consequently decompressing just above squaw's restriction. When Irvine blew bubbles from the dive tank he was carrying, he was in an air pocket beneath a limestone ceiling chimney. Overhead, limestone rocks began to crumble and drop to the ground, where they landed on a muddy incline. The restriction was closed and visibility was reduced to zero as a result of the rock and mud slide. Let's return to the main plot now. This strange occurrence confined Bill and Parker, and they reacted by regulating their gas supply while searching for a way out of the cave. The line had disappeared into the sand at the bottom of the tunnel when they arrived where they thought the squaw restriction should be. The majority of the line was too deeply buried to be removed once they began hauling out of the sand. There was no more than 1 foot of visibility in this area. "What is this?" Parker shouted into his regulator. They brought their staged bottles and motorbikes with them as they pulled out of the low area. At this point, Mill's second bottle was empty. He made the decision to switch to his doubles, which still had about 2,000 cc of gas after realizing that the issue was unlikely to be fixed immediately. There are currently still 2 parallel guidelines inside the cave. They made an effort to follow both of them, but each time the line got twisted up in the sand and other debris it had become trapped in. The main worry at this time was the pressing need for an exit. Bill then started looking for a way out while retrieving the guideline from the reel they had carried with them to the end of the permanent line where it was buried. Sand and possibly stones appeared to be inside the restriction. The vision was so bad that they had no idea where they were or even when it happened. Bill chose to go with the flow anyhow in order to look for a potential exit because there was still one. He began to wonder where the obstruction was exactly after realizing there was no way around it. Have they become disoriented? They must, nevertheless, find a way out. Parker then started his search while Bill swam roughly 300 feet back into the cave until he hit the upstream/downstream arrow marking. This confirmed that they were in the right location, but a sand, mud, and rock collapse had blocked the cave system's exit. For the next 45 minutes, they looked for an exit while Bill went back to Parker. As a result, their gas burned out because they were running low on fuel when they checked their pressure gauge. As panic set in, Parker handed Bill a slate and asked him what they would write on it. Bill's prior experience, he hoped, would help them securely exit the cave. Bill, however, lacked the expertise to handle this. Nevertheless, he made the decision to return to looking for exits. After tying his reel to the main line and looking for other exits, Bill decided to go back to the staged bottles because they had a little more gas to offer. Parker was nowhere to be seen when he returned to the bottles after being away for less than 5 minutes. He found his second stage bottle, still holding about 600 cc. It ran out after around 4 minutes, forcing him to switch back to his doubles on his back. But by this time, the gas gauge read less than 300 cc. This implies that with the little air he has left, he could suffocate in a few minutes. He had no choice but to make one last desperate effort to find an entrance. They had to get out of this cave or they would have died. He was fortunate to come across another line that had been connected into the permanent line, but in his haste, he never discovered how it had gotten there. He continued on until he reached a spot where the cave appeared to have an entrance. The second stage of a diving regulator was then caught in his peripheral vision, but he was still unsure of what it represented. By this time, his doubles were almost empty, but as he continued, a regulator became jammed on his manifold. To release it, he went to his left, and when he did so, he saw the permanent line rising at a higher place. At this point, he was aware that the restriction had been lifted, so he hurried to their decompression bottles, which were strung at a height of 100 feet. He hurried to the following row of bottles, even though he was going to run out of breath. When Parker got at the bottles, he still hadn't understood that he had already drowned. This is due to the fact that these bottles were intended for the two of them, and as Parker was not present, he had drowned after running out of air. He had earlier discovered a regulator, and that was Parker's line. Parker's body is probably drifting in the mud at that point because visibility was still less than 2 feet. He was forced to wait for their backup divers to discover him while grieving over the passing of his diving companion. The water immediately flooded in and filled the space after the breach due to the shards that split off and the loosening of the sand on the water's surface. As the water rushed into the new area and filled the squaw's restriction, loose sand and silt flowed inward. Just before the water was turned off, the water flow also carried all the silt to the opposite side of the obstruction. Although it commonly occurs with many water bodies, this sudden drop in the surface water level should have warned the support divers above that something was wrong. Divers are aware that the size of springs and caverns constantly changes depending on the flow of water. George, a member of the support team, and his teammate became alarmed when they saw that sand was re-entering the water. Despite the fact that the other team had already down about 20 feet, they decided to go check. He descended about 110 feet and saw that everything appeared to be in order. The bottles appeared to be in decent shape after his inspection. But because the squaw's restriction area had reopened, he noticed a lot of silt there. The silt that had previously obstructed it began to flow in as a result of it. In the belief that everything was in order, he and his partner returned to the surface. On the other hand, his partner was worried and thought something wasn't right. George denied having seen any of them when he was asked if he had. The fact that the bottles were still present provided him with comfort. A short while later, a different support team member was called from the water and asked whether he had seen Bill and Parker. He claimed to have seen Bill, and his companion claimed to have spotted Parker and waved. He then revealed to his buddy that it was actually him who had waved, not Parker. As a result, George's companion returned to the water after becoming persuaded that something was wrong. He let George know about he found Parker's tank dangling from the rope, and the divers were missing the tanks 2 minutes later. They both descended and tied into the rope because visibility was minimal. They started looking for the divers after attaching their line to the fixed line. Soon after, Bill was discovered to be immobile when George ran into someone. After seeing his movement, he checked his pressure gauges to make sure he had adequate gas. Bill, though, was acting oddly and nodding. He presented George with a slate that read, "Parker is dead." George was stunned by this and briefly experienced numbness. At that point, he understood that Bill was in shock and needed time to recover. He attempted to tell Bill, but when he didn't react, he tied a reel to his location and went to the surface to inform the others. He anchored his rope to the dock and let them know that Bill needed to be moved because he was immobile due to Parker's death. A second diver prepared his tank and followed George's line into the water. He was spotted and moved to a better position, but because of the additional time he had spent at deep, he had to remain there and decompress for 4 hours. Although Bill was informed of what the support divers knew, he was unaware of the cause of the cave's collapse. Fortunately, they hadn't descended too far during their exploration, so he wouldn't suffer from decompression sickness. After rejoining the main line, George started looking for Parker. He submerged himself so far that he ran out of oxygen and neglected to decompress, which led to decompression sickness. The team assumed that he had found a hiding location when he informed them of how far he had gone without coming across Parker. George countered that it was quite implausible at that depth. They alerted the police that they would have to suspend the search until the next day because they had ran out of gas. While the others left to acquire gas, 2 of the gang went to Parker's residence to tell his wife the terrible news. After Parker passed away, it is reported that his family moved back to Texas. We appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. If you like what you saw, click the bell icon, like, and subscribe buttons to be notified when we post another thrilling cave diving story.